Hi everyone, this is Amber Gardner. I'm with the California Fire Safe Council. Welcome to the webinar today on our 2018 competitive grant programs. Before it gets started, can everyone chime in the chat box and just make sure you can hear me fine? There we go. Yep. Awesome, thank you guys, that's really helpful. I have slotted today 2 hours to get through this webinar. It might take us an hour. Since there won't be a lot of time for questions and it's difficult through the chat box, it may go a lot faster than I anticipated. But we've got 2 hours. You are welcome to type in questions as we go along. I'll try to answer them, but I do want to get through the slides as fast as possible. So if there's a longer question, then we will we'll talk about it later. I've sent you email contact info about where all this information is posted on our website. So you can find a handbook there, a printed PDF of that. Some of you may have been mailed the copy of the handbook as well. If you still want a copy of the handbook mailed to you, you just need to email Delana Scott at dscott@cafiresafecouncil.org with your mailing address, and she will mail you one of those handbooks. This webinar is being recorded. It will be posted on our website. You can find it there after this presentation. Hi, Neville. Thanks. You can't hear us. Let me turn up the volume. Sit closer to the microphone. Okay, great. So let's get started. Again, my name is Amber Gardner. I'm the Clearinghouse Administrator for the Fire Safe Council. With us today is a few grant specialists, so they may be available to answer questions later if something comes up here as well. So today we're going to talk about the 2018 grant cycle programs. All the information is on our website there, cafiresafecouncil.org. The application and all the materials to upload to your application is all available at ZoomGrants.com, but we will go over that in much more detail later. Hope everyone can see these slides. The grants in our program this year are all passed through from us from the Forest Service. And all of the information here we'll talk about, and the publications are funded in full by the Forest Service, Pacific Southwest region under the terms of the grant numbers, the 17 DG 1105 2012 122, and then the other ones are 139 and 147. And the opinions expressed are those of the authors and do not necessarily reflect the views of the U.S. Forest Service. Today we're going to talk about the grant programs that are available this year, a little bit about federal grants basics, just a brief bit about those. We'll talk a little bit about the grant life cycle phases, which means, the application phase happens if you're funded, what's next, what to expect. We'll go into great detail about writing an application, specifics about the questions, what we're looking for on the questions, scoring criteria, what you need to submit with your application, what additional documentation, and then the selection and award process for these grants. All right, this is our funny icebreaker slide when we do it in person. Why are you here today is you want to know about the money. So we're going to show you the money today. But we want you to know that our federal grants are not free money, and you don't have to accept them if you are awarded them. And then a successful grant application is more than just a good project proposal. It's also good grant management as well, and reporting. And our federal grants are subject to the applicable federal rules and regulations and terms and conditions of the grant program. So we're here to tell you about how to write a competitive grant application to our program, but also making sure that you're addressing all the rules and eligibility requirements to the grant program. Who are we? The California Fire Safe Council has been around for many years. I myself have worked here for 15 years of them. These posters you see on the slide is the original CAL FIRE prevention posters that were the product of our founder, Bruce Turbyville, and that's where the concept of California Fire Safe came together. We're a nonprofit organization. We have 2 offices. One is in McClellan, Sacramento area. That's our administrative office. And then one is in Ontario. The Sacramento office has 5 staff and the Ontario has 3. And we have been a pass-through for federal grant funds for, our first grant program was in 2003 and now we're at 2018. Originally, the Grants Clearinghouse was created by what was called the California Fire Alliance, and it's operated by us. It was a single place to apply for federal wildfire prevention grants. And back in the day, we had funds from BLM, Park Service, Fish and Wildlife Service. Today, this year's grant program is strictly Forest Service, but occasionally we get additional funders either mid-cycle or at the start of a cycle, and we may have more. Some other helpful resources about the grant program are on our website, like I mentioned before. There are links to all of our materials there as well. If you need more help after this or at any stage before the deadline, we are here to help. We have a new phone number for those of us that have used our old phone number. We're at 916-648-3600, and each of us has a different extension. When you call in, you'll be prompted to have that. You'll be prompted with the extension numbers. And this is our contact info for our Ontario field office as well. If you have the handbook with you, it'd be great to follow along. This slideshow follows along right with the handbook. So go ahead and get that handy, and I will mention some things in it as well. The slide deck is also available on our website already, so you can download it there. A copy of all the slides is there, so you can have that and print it out if you want to. All right, so the due dates. The applications are due online on May 15th. I think that's about 2.5 weeks away, so it's coming up soon, 5 p.m. And our preliminary award announcements will be in August. What's available this year? We have more money than we've had in the past couple years. This year it's about $5.45 million, and that's spread between 2 separate grant programs. The one on the left is the SFA-SMG grant program. SFA means State Fire Assistance, and SMG means Special Master Grant. That entire grant program has about $4.15 million available. Has a 50-50 match requirement, which means 50% of the entire project cost must come from you and 50% could come from the federal grant. So a $200,000 request in grant funds needs to be matched by $200,000 in-kind or cash from your organization. Projects must be located in California or the Tahoe Basin region of Nevada. So that's the 4.15. The other one is TMG, or Tree Mortality Grant Program. There's $1.3 million available for those. The match requirement is a little less strict. It's 75-25. So 75 from the grant, 25 from the applicant. There's $130,000 maximum on funding requests. So that means you can only request up to $100,000. $130,000, excuse me. And the projects must be located in one of the 10 tree mortality counties in California. So both grant programs, the SFA/SMG and the TMG, include the same type of projects. So I'm going to show you here about the SFA-SMG, but both of them can be for community hazard planning, mitigation, prevention and mitigation, education, and fuel hazard mitigation on non-federal lands. Both of them can do it. Both of them also focus on the cohesive strategy and California Forest Action Plan, and it's a 24-month grant term. Again, the 50-50 match can be cash or in-kind for the SFA-SMG. So, like I said, 50% project costs come from federal grant, 50% from match. There's a $200,000 maximum request, so you can, and there's a 2 application limit. So you can apply, you can submit 2 applications. Each can be for $200,000, but at max you will only be funded for one of those. Or you can do 2 applications, and each of them are for $100,000, and it's possible you can get funded for 2. For fiscal sponsors, it's a little different. They can submit 2 applications of their own and receive up to $200,000, plus manage up to $200,000 for other organizations, and this would be 2 other organizations total. The TMG, or the Tree Mortality Grant Program, same types of programs, projects, community hazard mitigation and planning, prevention and mitigation education, fuel hazard mitigation on non-federal land again, same thing, focus on cohesive strategy and California Forest Action Plan, a 24-month grant term. Joseph, yes, I'm saying that an application of $200,000 would need $200,000 matching by the applicant. If you were applying to the SFA-SMG grant program, yes. And that $200,000 match can be cash or in-kind. Stacy, yeah, TMG would fund a planning project only. Either of them would. What I've been recommending in workshops is that if you have a fuels component and you have a planning component, not to submit them in 2 separate applications, but to combine them all together. How do you value the in-kind? Joseph, that's a interesting question. It depends on the type of service the person is providing. So if you are going to hire someone to do something, but they're going to provide it as match, then you can either get their rate or the market value for that service they're providing. That's one way. Again, it depends on the service they're providing for the application. For the TMG grant program, the match is 75-25, so it's a less of a match requirement. $130,000 application maximum request, and a 2 application limit. Same details for the fiscal sponsors, 2 applications for themselves. Actually, this is 2 applications for themselves for $130,000. This slide is incorrect, I just realized. And then 2 for other individuals up to $130,000. The counties that are eligible for these grants are these ones listed here: Amador, Calaveras, El Dorado, Fresno, Kern, Madera, Mariposa, Placer, Tulare, and Tuolumne. And here they are. So eligible projects or types of projects. Oh, it doesn't go through this. So prevention, education, and outreach project examples would be door-to-door community outreach, creating outreach projects such as pamphlets, posters, mailings, hosting educational workshops and trainings. For fuel projects, it could be chipper programs, community-wide or curbside, community protection fuel breaks, vegetation thinning project, prescribed burning, maintenance of previous fuel reduction projects. And then for planning, it could be developing a CWPP or a community wildfire protection plan or equivalent plan. It can be conducting community risk and or hazard assessments, including those needed for FireWise Communities program. To be eligible for the program, you have to be an organization working in California or the Lake Tahoe Basin of Nevada representing your community. Nonprofits, POAs, Native American tribes. Yeah, Joseph, your question is do the matching funds need to be secured at the time of the application, or is there a period of time while the application is to be considered that matching funds can be lined up? They have to be secured at the time of the application, because you will need to submit a letter of commitment from the entity providing that match. In some examples where, let's say you're doing a community-wide chipper program and the match is going to come from homeowners, it doesn't necessarily be secured because it's going to be in-kind time, so you're just estimating that they will commit to so many hours of work for that project, but it's not cash in hand at that point. Desiree, no, it can't be on any federal land or land leased by a federal entity, so like a cabin leased on federal property. It can't. None of these projects can occur on that type of property. And Marjorie, POAs are eligible for what? For any of the grant application programs. You're the eligible entity. That's what that means. Okay, moving on. Okay, so that's the basics of the two grant programs, SFA-SMG and TMG. Like I mentioned earlier, the grants are federal grants coming from the Forest Service. So we wanted to give you a little bit of background on what managing a federal grant means and what are the applicable rules and regulations that may apply to you. The California Fire Safe Council is the recipient of the grant funds, and you guys would be the sub-recipient. Joseph, your question was, can matching funds be maintenance costs in subsequent years? Matching funds can only be counted if they occur during the life of the grant. So if it occurs after the grant has been completed, no, it cannot be. And it also cannot be before the grant starts. So any time now could not account. The start date of the grant is likely September, October, November of 2018, and you would get a sub-award that to give you the specific date. So any time that would be in kind could not be counted before that date, or it couldn't be counted after the date listed on your sub-award contract. So the role of you guys, if you're a grant recipient, is not only project implementation, but proper grant management. So making sure that you meet all the deadlines, you follow the grant rules, you provide accurate and complete reports, as well as accomplish grant objectives, implement the project as approved, monitor and track accomplishments. If you are not one of those eligible entities and you use a fiscal sponsor, that's great. Some groups just aren't ready yet or aren't incorporated to do business and they need a fiscal sponsor. So this is just to remind you that you can utilize the services of, let's say for an example, a resource conservation district or a county fire district, and they can assume assume legal responsibility for the management of the grant funds. So they would sign the sub-award, they would receive the grant funds, they would prepare reports. Each entity is a little different. Some fiscal sponsors may be more involved than others, but this is an option for you if you're not an eligible entity. All right, so we always like to ask folks, should you apply for our grants? Do you have the capacity to manage the project? Do you have a financial management system? Do you have the necessary project management expertise? Do you have the necessary access to professionals who can assist in planning? Do you have experience in successful project management? Do you have staff or volunteer time available to manage and complete the grant project? Can you handle the added workload, or can you, do you have the capacity to add additional workload? Does your financial management system meet federal requirements? We'll talk about this later, but in the pre-forward phase, we will go through your financial management systems and make sure that they meet the federal requirements. Since the grant funds awarded through the clearinghouse originate from the federal government, all subrecipients are required to comply with the applicable federal regs. The federal regulations include a wide variety of topics and provide expectations of the grantee organization. The regulations specify how to properly implement the grant, include detailed information on how to document expenses and match towards the grant. We strongly recommend that you guys take the time now to read the federal regulations in order to familiarize yourself with what will be expected if awarded a grant. Our recipients are required to have written policies that ensure proper handling of the funds. The policies demonstrate that the organization has internal controls to protect, spend, and manage the grant funds accurately and in compliance with the grant requirements. Here's a sample of the written policies that are necessary. When drafting and revising your written policies, refer to the federal regs applicable to your organizations. Yeah, which is 2 CFR 200. I think we're getting there. An example of an administrative requirement that will be required of you if you were to have a grant is to make sure that certain parties are not debarred or suspended that may work on your grant project. So any of your contractors, any of your personnel, if you have personnel, subcontractors have to be searched to make sure that they're not on that list. It's really easy. You can do it in under 5 minutes. You just go to this website, enter the name of the person, and see if they're on that list. An example of a cost principle of the federal regulations is to make sure that the support of salaries and wages, they are allowable as grant costs. If it is, as listed here, it's reasonable, it conforms to the established policy of the organization, and is determined and supported but with documentation as provided by the applicable cost principles. Documentation for these must meet the federal standards. And we go into a lot more detail later about what the documentation should look like. So matching funds, we talked about those a little bit. It can be cash or in-kind or services that come from non-federal sources. So all matching contributors must meet all of the criteria listed below. One is they're verifiable. They're not included as contributions for any other federally assisted project or program, are necessary, they're reasonable, they're allowable, and they're allocable. So as a subrecipient, you are required to comply with the applicable federal regs. The federal regulations specify how to properly implement the grant. And again, take the time now to read those. Okay. The next section is a little bit about the grant cycle phases, just so you're familiar with what would happen in the different phases of the grant. Right now we're in the application phase. You're preparing and you're submitting your application, making sure that you're evaluating your organizational capacity or figuring out a situation which has applicable capacity. and you submit your project by the deadline. If you are notified that you have preliminary selected to receive an award, you go through the pre-award phase. And the pre-award phase is when we do the project review and risk assessment. So we screen your organization for, well, initially we screen your application for completeness, and then the review committee and the scoring, and then makes the scoring and then recommends to the board. And then if you are initially awarded the grant, then you do the pre-award report, submit required maps, additional documentation, undergo an organizational capacity risk assessment, and then you would review and sign your sub-award agreement. Post-award phase is once the project is going, we go through environmental compliance review. So California Fire Safe Council has a contract with a registered professional forester who will do a compliance review of your project. We'll talk about that in more details later. And notify you of the status of that if there are any mitigation measures that need to be taken. Post-award phase, you'll select your contractors and your vendors. You'll complete your project tasks, monitor and track project accomplishments, and there could be a site visit. Also in the post-award phases, you will request and receive grants, submit your quarterly reports on time, track all your expenditures, document, and maintain an organized grant file. Closeout phase, you will do your final progress report, your closeout report, which is a separate report, return any unspent or disallowed grant funds or excess interest, and you must retain your grant file until 3 years after CFC's master grant closes, and you will be notified of that. This may be several years past the date your grant ended, therefore we will notify you when you can dispose of your grant files. So the California Fire Safe Council takes grant fraud seriously. Remember, when you sign a sub-award, you're entering into a legally binding agreement with us. You have the legal responsibility to ensure that federal grant funds are used properly and are therefore subject to penalties if you do not comply with federal grant regulations. Some examples of grant fraud include conflict of interest, material false statements, and penalties for any of these can be repayment of grant funds, disallowance, suspension, debarment. Yeah, hi, Will. We are going to send out a email to those master grants that have closed. So be on the lookout for those. There haven't been many. Okay, so common misconceptions. You're just a volunteer, so you don't need to comply. Not true. They apply to all. The regulations apply to all grant recipients. It's too much of a hassle, so I don't need to comply, and we like to change that. It's too much of a hassle, so you don't need to apply. And my application was selected. I'm doing everything right, and I'll receive the grant funds no matter what. Not necessarily. We like to say that when you're notified in August, your application, your project has been selected, but your organization needs to be selected next. So that's when you that's when you undergo the pre-award evaluation and then ongoing monitoring throughout the life of the grant to make sure that you're properly managing the grant. Okay, this is where we normally take a break in our workshop, but these are interesting statistics here, and I leave these up here so the hope is by doing prevention in California, and these projects will reduce or eliminate the disasters and the destruction caused by wildfire in California. So which wildfire do you think is the largest California wildfire? Thomas. Yeah, Thomas. Here you can see Thomas is the largest wildfire last December. And it was by acres. Joseph said, are matching funds and grant funds combined to do the project, or are the funds segregated for distinct activities? Yeah, I think the answer is as long as they're combined. So when we go through the application, you'll see that, you know, we'll ask you what activities are being done with match dollars and what activities are being done with grant dollars. So you will give us an estimate of that. Okay, next pop quiz is, how many of California's top 20 most destructive wildfires occurred in the last 5 years? Anybody know? C8. Yeah, you guys are on the ball. Correct. It is C. 40% of California's top 20 most destructive wildfires occurred in the last 5 years. And if you look through this list, several of them were last fall. Okay, now we're going to talk about writing an application. When you want to start to write an application, first you have to make sure you have a ZoomGrants account with us. To open an account, it's free, but you need to go onto our website here at this cafiresafecouncil.org/ZoomGrants login and start a new account there. A few words about your account is that each organization's account is owned, accessed, and managed by a single set of login credentials. So if you have multiple people that need full access to the application in your account, we recommend setting the email address to either be the person who will be primarily responsible or a general email address that everyone can log in through. Also, that's helpful if you have individuals that may or may not leave the organization, and once they leave, then their email address and their password go with them. So if it's a general email address, then if anyone leaves, anyone can access it. You can add collaborators to your account, so if you want one person to be in control of it, but you want other people to be able to look and edit it, we'll go through a slide that shows you how you can add collaborators to your account to make changes, etc. If the account owner leaves your organization, make sure they have shared their latest account credentials before you leave so they can continue to access the account. You'd have to submit a support request if someone has left your organization and you don't know your login and password. All right, so if you've already got an account with us, then the first step you'll need to take is to go to the same website and open up, hit the apply button for either of the programs that you want to apply to. And what that does is pull it into your individual account that you already have open. If you just log into your ZoomGrants account, if you have grants with us now, you won't see these grant programs there. So you have to go through our website first, pull the application into your account, and then you can access it like you normally do and work on it from there. Once you have the application pulled into your account, you can always go through just the ZoomGrants.com page with your username and password. ZoomGrants does have a technical support team that's available. They have a toll-free number. They are helpful as well. So if you can't get a hold of one of our staff people, if it's a more technical issue with Zoom, like something's not saving or or character count is off, you can always contact them and see if they can answer your question. All right, so this is what your account home looks like once you've pulled the applications into your account. It'll say Open Programs. You have the title of your account or your application, and then you can, anything that's in yellow is usually a hyperlink to open up a different page. Your home, My Account Home will take you to the all the other applications in your account. I'm wondering if I should make this bigger. Oh, I don't want to do that. Wow. Okay. That might be easier for you to see, but see, I can't see if they're talking. Let's go here again. Okay. So this is the application itself. There are 5 tabs at the top that are sort of the program tabs, some of which are the description of the grant program, additional online resources, restrictions for the grant program, and a contact admin. And then down in the middle part of the screen are the grant program tabs, which take you through the different parts of the application. So instead of saying how many pages this application is, we say it has 5 tabs. So you have to go through each tab before you can submit it. You can go in any order you want. Some things to note about using ZoomGrants is it has an auto-save feature. So once you're done with completing a field and you navigate to the next field, it'll automatically save it for you. There's no save button to hit at any time. However, if you don't let it save and start typing in another field, I've heard sometimes it will not save. So just let the save process be completed. You can also make the application bigger or larger by using Control plus or minus, or there's in the upper right hand corner there's a plus and minus for the size of the font as well. There's no version control on these, so if you've made a bunch of changes to your application and go, oh, I actually like yesterday's version better, there's no ability to get back to that version. So some suggestions I would have for you are, we have a Word document on our website, or we'll have it soon, called our application planning tool, which is just a Word document of the entire application. So you can write it all there, and it even has notes about how much characters are allowed in each question. So you can write it all there, spell check it, look at it over with your collaborators, and then when you're ready to put it in ZoomGrants, then you can cut and paste it there. All right. Then this is the different tabs you have to go through. We're going to go through each one. Okay, so the first tab on the application is pretty basic stuff. It's called the application snapshot. It's just going to ask you the project name, the amount requested, the match amount, your applicant name. So the applicant name would be the name of the individual filling out the application, or the project manager, and then the organization, so the organization you're affiliated with. And then we ask for another contact information, and this is typically like your executive director or your board chair or your president or your CEO of your organization, and we'd like that person to be different from the first entry. And then down in the middle of the slide you see that we ask about collaborators. If you want to add people to the specific application that would review and edit this application, they cannot submit it for you. Only the entity that controls the credentials of the login can submit it, but the collaborators can edit and review it. And then lastly is a question about additional contacts for the application, and it would just be email addresses, no names. And this would be the individuals you want included on emails we send through ZoomGrants about your project. So if it's chairperson or someone else involved in the project, you can put their email addresses there. All right, so the second slide asks you about your organization. For those of you who have your handbook, I'll point you to the very last tab of the handbook, which is called the RFA, or the Request for Applications. And in it, it'll give you an overview of everything we're talking about today. But in the back of it is the scoring criteria. And I'm going to reference this a couple times through this presentation. The scoring criteria is the scoring criteria that our review committee uses. So make sure you've read it and become familiar with it. I always recommend that you have someone else review your application and go through the scoring criteria and maybe give you some recommendations if it looks like there should be some clarity on our issues, etc. So that's on page 18 in your handbook at the very last tab called Request for Application. That's your scoring criteria. And a couple of the questions address your organizational capacity and who you are. So that may be good for you to know. So this tab will ask you about who's involved in this project, the individuals. Are they volunteer? Are they staff? What are the roles and responsibilities of everyone? What is the history of doing similar grants? And, how many of them were they and how much were the grant for? So there's a whole bunch of questions there. And if you have a fiscal sponsor, it will ask you the questions about your organization as well as the same questions for your fiscal sponsor. All right, so the next tab is your project information. And just be sure to stay focused on what each question is asking and do not be repetitive. And don't use any local acronyms in the project description. So kind of take a step back and say, we're in this county, in this city. Don't expect that we'll understand, what the western slope of something looks like. So, don't be lengthy, but also be focused on exactly what question we're asking. So here's where we ask you to identify the problem, describe the project activities, how do the activities address the problem, who will be involved in the planning and implementation. We'll ask you to describe the direct benefit of the project, how will the project help the community. And there are scoring criteria questions about, the narrative part of your grant. So, the funders as well as California Fire Safe Council want to make sure that the grant project has a lasting impact in the community. And that sustainability is addressed. And this is a really tough one for a lot of our applications, or it has been in the past. We just want to know that this is not a project that you're going to expect funds from every year, that maybe this first infusion of funds will help you garner collaborators and support, and maybe individuals are willing to maintain this project in the future, or there's a way to develop a bigger program here. So in this section, you're going to tell us about how you're going to engage the public. So telling them what you're doing, if you're doing a chipping project, making sure there's signage, or you're able to do door-to-door visits or a workshop on chipping. Tell them, what it needs to look like, or a risk assessment, community welfare protection plan. And then how will the project be maintained after it's completed? How will the project lead the community to investing in making itself fire safe after the grant term ends? There's definitely a scoring criteria question there as well. Here we ask you all kinds of community impacts that your project will have. So there's what we call a CAR list, a Communities at Risk list. There's a link to it on our website. It's a list maintained by CAL FIRE. We'll ask you what communities at risk are in your project. And then we'll also ask you any other communities that aren't on that list. If there's fire-wise communities, you can let us know those as well. And then we'll also want to know about the political boundaries, the congressional, Senate, state assembly districts. We want to know about the federal land adjacencies. So are there federal lands near your project, BLM, Park Service, etc.? We'll ask you to tell us which lands, what's the name of them, how far away they are. And then how many individuals will you be employing through this project? And that includes salaried employees and contractors, full or part-time. There's a couple different plans that are the main emphasis of this funding source, and one is the National Cohesive Wildland Fire Management Strategy, or the Cohesive Strategy as it's commonly called, and that the Wildland Fire Leadership Council created this National Cohesive Wildland Fire Management Strategy. And we just want to know that your project addresses the nation's wildfire problems by focusing on the key areas listed in the cohesive strategy. So the key areas are restore and maintain resilient landscapes, fire-adapted community development, and response to wildfire. Your project should advance the goals of the cohesive strategy. There are links to the strategy in the application. And once you get to the questions in the applications, there's more description of these goals and how your project may advance them. Another one is the California Forest Action Plan. We want you to indicate how your project will link to the California Forest Action Plan's 3 main themes. So we want to make sure federal funds to be used to implement actions that utilize strategies within priority landscapes. So the 3 main themes there are conserve, protect, and enhance. And some examples of enhancing would be the formation of local fire safe councils or participation in a FireWise communities program. An example of protecting would be reduce the impacts of wildfire on ecosystem health, or protect life and property from wildfire. So those are just some examples. This illustration shows the vast range of activities that help create and support fire-adapted communities. So it just shows you most of you are probably doing at least one of these activities, and that's great. And that goes back to the cohesive strategy, and they want to create fire-adapted communities. Okay, the next couple questions.
Is water storage contemplated at all in these? It's a common question.
No. Joseph, your question, I'm sorry. Joseph asked, is water storage contemplated at all in these? And the answer is no. Okay, so location and condition of project area. Just want to know the latitude and longitude of your project. Are there fire hazard severity zones, or what's the fire regime and condition class of your project? There are links to all of these in the application. CAL FIRE can assist if you're having trouble. And you will submit a vicinity map at the time of application about your project. And so here's a sample of a good one that gives you, just an X on where the project will be in the area so you can get an idea. And then, of course, it has the right labeling of the name of the entity and what quad this is on, etc. Okay, so if your project contains any fuel components, we'll ask you a whole bunch of questions. If it's just planning, you don't need to answer these questions. But here's where we ask you about the vegetation type that's to be treated. Shirley, do you want lat and long for large projects? Just a central point or the office location of where you're at. If you are to be funded, we'll ask for a specific map, a detailed project map that will give us a real specifics of where it is. But yeah, a central point in the project. What else can I tell you about fuels treatment? We want to know about the pre and post treatment site, if a project will generate biomass. a registered professional forester can help with a lot of these questions, and we highly recommend that you use them in the planning process as well as the implementation process. They can help you with how the treatment will be performed, what type of equipment will be used, who will perform it, and how they will work on the project. We want to know the total acreage of the project area, the number of fuels treatment projects to be completed, and an example would be if you have 2 different fuel breaks in 2 different locations, and the number of projects could be 2 because they're 2 separate fuel breaks. However, if you're chipping and you're chipping in 150 different homes, it's still 1 fuel project, not 150 projects. Okay, so I mentioned earlier we have a forester that reviews your project for environmental compliance. And your project may include species, habitats, cultural resources, or historical sites that require special protection. So our forester will do some record searches prior to project implementation and let you know the status of those, if there are any mitigation measures to be taken to avoid any of the federal laws, which are listed right here. CEQA and CISA are your responsibility, so you can speak to our forester about those, but they're your responsibility to comply with. And you can include costs for doing archaeological surveys or any other searches in your budget. If you have questions about that, we can give you some general numbers if we know them. But generally, sometimes it's hard to tell before your project, if we don't really know much about your project. Yeah, there's a website that you can look to find a forester who may really assist with prescriptions for treatment, environmental site considerations, etc. Okay, so we have 2 tabs left in the application, and that's the Tables tab, and then it'll be the Document Upload tab. Tables tab is where we ask you for your work plan and the budget and the matching and your deliverables. Marjorie asked, can you put environmental reviews in the proposal? No, but we do ask you a question if there have been environmental reviews done. We ask you to list those. So you can give us the title and the date it was completed, but you don't need to include those with your application. And I don't know what the cost would be. Are you asking for if there's additional ones reviewed? It really just depends. It's so project specific, it's hard to give you a number. Okay, so the first table is the work plan. Marjorie, you can't be reimbursed for anything that occurred before the start of the grant. So if you were to do reviews before the grant started, no, you wouldn't be reimbursed. But if it occurred during the life of the grant, it may be able to be reimbursed. Let me go back here. So the work plan is where we ask you sort of like the recipe for success. Tell us exactly what you're doing, what the outcome is, who's going to be doing it, the time frame. The reviewers really look at it to just get a snapshot of what's happening when and the parties that are doing it. The second table are the deliverables, and here's when we ask you about the cost and the activity you're doing in the grant. So for example, we'll ask you, you're going to do hazardous fuel reduction, and how many acres of that, and how much is it going to cost the grant, and how much is it going to be supplied by the match. See, Stacy asked, is it going to be a place where we can upload pictures of project conditions? Are they are now? No, we don't want to see any projects of they are now. You need to describe them in your narrative of what the project is like now. Joseph, if road improvement was required to access the project area, could some of the grant funds be used for that? Not likely. No construction costs whatsoever. So construction of a new road may not be available. It just depends on it. If not, could match funds be used? Probably not either. That's a gray area. That's something you might want to call us and tell us more details about that. So here's a sample of what the deliverables tables looks like. We have 3 different sections here. One is on planning, one is on education, and one is on fuels treatment. You'll tell us the quantity of how many things. So for example, in the planning, if you're doing a CWPP or you're doing a fire management plan, how many of those? Usually those are just 1, 2, or 3. And then how much of the federal grant dollars and how much match will go toward completing that piece. If you have education programs or products, how many of those will be completed? If you're just making one brochure but printing it 5,000 times, just put 1 down, not 5,000. But if you are doing 50 different workshops, then you can put 50 workshops if they're different workshops. And then the last part is the fuels treatment. So you tell us the acres treated by treatment type. So let's, for example, your whole project is only 10 acres, but you're going to do some prep for treatment, you're going to do some lop and scatter, and some thinning, etc. You can put the same 10 acres several times, so 2 or 3 times. So at the bottom, your total may be 30 acres. Even though your project's only 10, it'll say 30, because we want to know how many acres by treatment type. These are just some samples of the types of project deliverables. Okay, so another table in here is budget detail. Joseph, are winter burn piles allowed? Oh, that just depends on where your project is, what species are there. They've certainly been allowed in some projects in the past, but your specific project, I don't know. The budget details where you break down all the costs by cost category: personnel, fringe, travel, equipment, supplies, contractual, etc. The things I want to make clear here is that personnel and fringe are only to be detailed if the applicant entity has employees. So if the applicant entity is all volunteers, but you have a collaborator that has employees, all that should go down in contractual. Personnel is solely just if you have employees, the applicant organization has employees. Travel, any costs that occurred during the life of the grant for travel related, you can let us know. We do want detail. It is called a budget detail for a reason. So for personnel, we would like you to say program director, 20 hours at $20 an hour for $3,000, whatever the number is, and then that number will be put into the grant details. So tell us how you came up with those numbers as well. Terry asked, can training of crews used in project work be included? Possibly. Without knowing more details, it possibly could. Okay, travel costs, equipment. Equipment is, none of these projects can pay for, none of these grants can have equipment in the grant application. Equipment is defined as a tangible item with a unit cost of $5,000 or more and a lifespan of more than 1 year. So like a chipper would be considered equipment. If you want to use chainsaws or weed whackers or type of hand tools like that, those would all go under supplies. Vehicle purchases are not allowable. But prior to submitting the grant application, you must submit a cost-benefit analysis, including a comparison of purchasing equipment versus borrowing from another program or renting it. So basically we're saying we do not want equipment purchased here. Supplies can be purchased, but not equipment. All right, contractual for any companies, professionals, or individuals that are hired as contractors or consultants for the project. Oh, I'm sorry, Joseph, yes. Fringe means employee benefits, absolutely. Include all of the details here for contractual. If you are going to hire an advertising company or a program manager or web hosting or a contract fuel crew, rental costs for chippers or vehicles, we want the total breakdown on where those costs are going. Enter the job title and number of individuals that will work on the project, provide a breakdown for the total cost. However, we don't want you to name the entity because you shouldn't have already pre-selected the vendor at this point. You can just submit how much you think you would pay for that type of a cost, and you could know that certainly by calling around and getting some quotes on what they would cost to hire for that type of service. The other category really are for costs that do not fall within the scope of the above categories. So they can include insurance, printing, meeting room costs, permit fees, volunteer or homeowner in-kind contributions, etc. So the modified total direct costs represents the expenses of doing business that are not readily identified with a particular grant, contract, or project function. If your organization already has a federally approved indirect cost rate, then you have to use that, and we will ask you to submit that form along with your application. If you do not have one, you can choose to take this, what we call the 10% de minimis, which is 10% of modified total direct costs to account for those indirect costs there. If you have a handbook, there are really detailed instructions as well as a great example of how to calculate modified total direct costs and fill that out in your budget detail. So I would recommend looking at that. But again, if you have a negotiated indirect cost rate, you cannot take the 10% de minimis, and you don't have to take it. It's something that is up to your organization to decide. Yeah. Okay, the very last topic in the table is the match amount by all organizations. So this is where you'll list all the collaborators you have for this project, what type of match, is it cash or in kind, and how much they're going to commit to the project. For each line here, you should also submit a letter of commitment from them saying exactly the same thing here as far as how much they're committing, but providing details of what that consists of. So is it a certain amount of hours of time? If it is, what rate are you using to value their time? And what activities are they going to provide for that rate?
Did you answer this question here about training of crews?
I did, yeah. We don't want letters of support, so if you have letters from any of your congressional representatives or county representatives, that's fantastic, but we don't need them, nor should you submit them to this application. And there's only 5 lines here, so if you have more than 5 collaborators, then we recommend that you just combine some on a line and just put a total there, but you'll still need individual letters from each individual entity. So here's a sample of what the match would look like. On this example, CAL FIRE is doing in-kind time with a value, etc. Yeah, good question, Joseph. After you have a template of a letter from the match partner, if you have a handbook, there's a tab that says sample LOCs, and there's 3 or 4 in there, and a letter of commitment cover letter as well. So that's useful to have. Also in the handbook, while I'm looking at it, I'll point you to, there is a sample environmental compliance letter that we send our applicants that details any mitigation measures or determinations. So that's useful to read. There's a lot of information there about the compliance process as well. There's also a sample fiscal sponsor agreement. If you are using a fiscal sponsor, we will ask that you submit the fiscal sponsor agreement that details what each individual will be doing on the grant. So we'd like to see it at the time of application, and it should be signed and dated by all parties. There's a sample map in the handbook as well. Gives you details on what we're looking for with the map. The documentation for match and expense. Every item that was purchased with grant funds or submitted as match must have documentation. When we get into the grant and reporting, we will ask for every receipt, proof of payment, evidence of an invoice, etc. Personnel costs, volunteer time, all has to be documented. So if you have questions about that, it's a good time to call beforehand just so you know what you're getting into, and make sure that your reporting system is kind of, you can either scan all these pieces of paper or you have someone that is available to do this for your organization. The last tab here is the Documents tab. This is where you upload several of the items. The ones that is required is the letters of commitment and the letters of commitment cover letters. The cover letter just is an overview of everything you've submitted and kind of has the total at the bottom so we can track them all. The project vicinity map, if it's just a planning project, then there is nothing to map. You don't need to submit it. The fiscal sponsor agreement, if you have a fiscal sponsor. An indirect cost rate agreement, if you have an indirect cost rate. When you go to upload, what will happen is, go back here, you'll select the upload button next to the section of the document you want to upload. It'll open a new tab, which looks like this. It'll ask you to find the document on your computer and give it a title, and then there's a button at the bottom that says Upload Now, and it will give you a little pop-up window when it's successfully uploaded. Our ZoomGrants system will just check to make sure there's a document in that section. It won't check to make sure that that document is applicable. So if you put your child's birth certificate in there, it won't say, oh, wrong document. It'll just be in there. And so just make sure and check that you uploaded the correct document. There is a 4 megabyte limit on the documents at this stage. It shouldn't be a problem. You can always snap up big maps so they fit that, or make a PDF of them. Letters of commitment are required, like I mentioned, from all contributors. They must include a description and dollar value of the match. Signature, again talking about the fiscal sponsor agreement. Here's an example of a project vicinity map. Once you've submitted everything, or are ready to submit everything, the ZoomGrants system will do an error check to make sure every question is answered and every document has something if it's a required document. In this sample here, there's lots of errors, and so it won't let you submit it until you've completed the errors. So you scroll down, go through all the arrows, and then once you're good to go, ZoomGrants will give you a little checkbox to put your initials in to say that you're certifying that the information is true and accurate, and you're certifying that. Oh, hold on, I'm going to read the question. Yes, we are saying it must be specific bid for this project. not a multi-bid process to select a vendor for multiple projects. So this slide shows that once you submit it, you will get an application submitted, like a timestamp. And so that confirms that you did submit it. If there is no timestamp and you don't get an email from us saying that it was submitted on such day at such time, then it wasn't submitted, give us a call. I'd say 90% of our applications are submitted within the last 48 hours. We're here to help you, but if you have questions in the last 48 hours, it could be difficult to get a hold of us. So I recommend you start as early as possible. If you submit it and have questions, we can answer it then, but in the last 48 hours, it gets to be a lot of panic. Stacy, you asked me if you received a copy of the handbook. Is all this information in it? It sure is. Here's some recommendations for submitting your grant application. Make a schedule, identify match, make sure the application is complete and submitted on time. Coming to this training today is one big step. Yeah, Stacy, you asked if we're going to resubmit a project that was not funded last year with project application improvements. Can we name the same as last year? Certainly you can name it the same, but we hope that everything in it has changed, at least with updated letters of commitment and a new budget if necessary, and just confirming that all the same collaborators are willing to be involved. And if your map is from last year, you need to give us, updated dates, etc. Great, sounds great. Keys for success. So what's next? So your applications are due online May 15th. That's in 2.5 weeks. From May 15th to June 9th, we have an initial application screening and review committee process. Then we'll let you know in August the decisions, and then from August to September, we will do the organizational capacity, the pre-award risk assessment. The initial screening, when you submit your application, we just want to make sure your application is complete, you're an eligible organization, you've only submitted 2, the grant amount requested does not exceed it, your match is good, your letters of commitment are good, a fiscal sponsor agreement and map was submitted, budgeted costs are allowable, there's no equipment in there or unallowable charges, there's no projects occurring on federal land or federal partners that are committing match, deliverable costs are consistent. Those that pass the initial screening will be reviewed and scored by the volunteer panel of experts in wildfire issues and federal grants. Then this committee recommends the projects for funding to the California Fire Safety Council Board of Directors. Again, this is more about the organizational capacity and risk assessment. It's usually a series of documents you submit to us that we review, and then we do a phone interview with you and those responsible, if it's a fiscal sponsor or a financial management team. We go through your policies and procedures. We'll ask you about procurement, and at that point we'll make a determination if you're ready to go to the next stage. Some things to think about. How do you track and receive and use matching contributions? Is it a guess? Do you say, I think a couple people showed up to that. Let's just put down $1,000. That's not acceptable. We need signed, dated forms from every individual working. We can give you some more details on that if you give us a call. What is your procurement policy? Do you have limits for certain things? Who's allowed to purchase things? How many people sign checks? How do you test costs for reasonableness? Who has the authority to sign official documents? And have you reviewed the 2 CFR 200 and made sure your policies and procedures are in line with it? And that's it. Again, I recommend getting the grant application handbook. It has all this information in it in great detail. Again, email Delana Scott if you'd like a already printed copy. There is some PDF one there. Stacy asks, can I ask if there are minimum or maximum program size, for example, a small HOA? No. Not really.
There's a maximum.
Yeah, I mean, there's a maximum dollar amount you can request. Is, you know, for the SFA it's $200,000, and for the TMG it's $130,000. But as far as program size, do you mean like for how many acres the project is, or something like that? There's no maximum amount. No, Joseph, there's no carbon calculation requirement. Okay, I'll stay on for the line for another 5 or 10 minutes. If you guys want to chat in some questions, I'd be happy to stay here and answer them. But again, thanks for coming today. This will be recorded and logged onto our website, so you can listen to it there. As always, contact any of us with specific questions if you have, and good luck.